Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Mark Sleboda joins us today from Moscow, returns to the show to talk about the political affairs in Ukraine, the recent snap elections in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. The throw the bums out trend continues, and the new president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and his brand new political party now has a rare absolute majority, and they begin the task of actually governing this troubled state. Mark is an International Affairs and Security Analyst, a U.S. Navy veteran, a university lecturer, and a foreign policy realist. We recorded this on August 7th, 2019. You also might want to go back and listen to episode 99, where Mark and I began this discussion on the political situation and the elections in Ukraine, and you can find the link to that in the show notes. Mark Sleboda is here speaking to us from Moscow. Hey, Mark. Thanks for coming back on the show. It's great to talk to you.
Joanne, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on your show. It's good to be back.
Thanks. So, Mark, the last time we talked, Zelensky had just been elected, and he had basically no backup in the Rada, the Ukraine parliament, and we really weren't sure how, where this was going to go. It was quite a mystery. So I was hoping today that you could fill us in on what has happened since then. I know that he's now got, a majority in the parliament too, and this is just like the miracle prime minister or something.
Yeah, there have been some really rather interesting and potentially extremely ground-shaking political events in Ukraine. Even after this dark horse political candidate, this comedian turned president, was elected by a really large, overwhelming margin a few months ago. He did come to office with a hostile opposition, largely loyal to the defeated outgoing oligarch president, Petro Poroshenko, in control of the Rada. Leaving him fairly powerless. He called for Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, he called for snap elections. And after this being contested a few times in court, it did go forward. To no one's surprise, these snap elections went very well for him. To everyone's surprise, he came out of them even better than expected with an absolute majority, which is the first time in Ukrainians' independent history since 1991 this has happened. And this gives him both a popular and a legislative and electoral mandate for his policies, whatever they may be, and no one is still entirely sure going forward. His party, he named his party Servant of the People, Sluga Naroda, after his television show where he played the president. That was the name of the show, Servant of the People. And in fact, his show, Servant of the People, is available on Netflix, including in the United States. So if you really want to get an eye on this man and at least how he presents how he would like to be and govern, his campaign persona, if you will, go to Netflix, look up Servant of the People, and you can watch it at home. If not, you can certainly watch clips from it on YouTube and so. But I strongly encourage you to do so. It might give you some insights from a certain perspective into not only him, but life in modern Ukraine as well. After he won the presidential election, his party was brand new. He just created it. It had no representatives in the Rada, no representatives in any elected or bureaucratic office anywhere in the country. There were zero of them. And now suddenly his party is dominating the Rada and has an absolute majority. It's a pretty big sea change, a watershed mark, possibly, in Ukrainian politics. We know that the people outright rejected the former president, the oligarch Petro Poroshenko, who ran on a nationalist and, if you will, national security campaign, who had originally come to power at the hands of this quite openly West-backed putsch that occurred back in 2014. So the people completely rejected that to an astonishing degree. And one of the reasons Zelensky won is because he was extremely vague on what policies he would enact going forward. He said some things that would encourage voters in the west of the country and some things that would encourage voters in the east of the country. He was strongly against corruption, but what presidential candidate in Ukraine has ever been for corruption, right? Yeah. It's always more of a throw the bums out. And this vagueness really helped him get elected. And because of the snap elections, he was able to carry this vagueness going forward and win himself a absolute majority in the Rada with it. The problem is now he will actually have to govern, and there is no way on earth that he can balance and keep both West and East Ukraine happy. And not only that, but the people that he has elected in his party, none of them by design have ever themselves served in any political office, the Rada or any other before. They are all not his cabinet, but his entire Rada at this point. His cabinet isn't even completely formed yet. But his entire party in the Rada are all complete neophytes.
Whoa.
Every one of them. Now, a number of them, a minority, but a significant minority of them have been political aides and the like to other politicians in other parties, but they have never actually held office themselves. And there are a lot of people that are like him with absolutely no background in politics whatsoever. In fact, Kiev University for Higher Economics just held a crash training course for 2 weeks to try to bring his party's members in the Rada up to speed on basic politics, law, etc. So they will know hopefully something before taking their seats. And there's also the problem is that they come from all political perspectives in Ukraine. Again, because his own campaign, his own public persona was so vague and undefined. There are people who are very pro-Maidan. There are people who are very pro-East Ukraine in there. There are people who did serve as political aides to former members of the Rada. There are all sorts of potentially, fratricidal political views within his party. So not only do you have to will he now have to govern with a complete group of neophytes who don't know politics at all. And that's not necessarily completely bad, because certainly the last few decades of those with political experience hasn't benefited Ukraine to any degree, which is why the toss all the bums out carried the day. Sentiment carried the day, but they may not agree with policies that he brings forward himself. There's no unified political party platform or ideology. No one knows what servant of the people actually stands for, other than it is a cult of the individual around Zelensky, whom himself is vague and at least except to himself and a group of his closest aides, somewhat of a mystery. We do know that he has ties to the previously exiled Ukrainian Jewish oligarch. He's a dual Israeli-Ukrainian citizen. That's technically illegal under Ukrainian law, but the Ukrainian law has never really applied to the political and business elites. So Igor Kolomoisky, he owns one of the biggest television channels in the country. One of the channel that Zelensky's show aired on, and that really campaigned for him as president. Kolomoisky was originally a backer of the Maidan putsch. He was one of the funders of the Maidan protests. And then, despite being Jewish and Israeli citizen, he directly funded and armed a number of the extremist Banderite battalions, right, including the two of the biggest, Azov and Aidar. Right? If you want to understand them as neo-Nazis, that's fine. They are Banderite fascists who, glorify the genocidal Nazi collaborators like Stefan Bandera and others in the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian insurgent army in World War II. These are their descendants. He funded and armed them, despite being Jewish and Israeli. And this is part of the whole thing. Russia media is often castigated as portraying Ukraine as a fascist country, an anti-Semitic country, after the events of 2014. Well, that's not actually what Russia says. Ukraine isn't a fascist country, but it does have a significant minority of those with Banderite beliefs. And these Banderites, they're not overly politically, fond of Jewish people, but at least first and primarily, the principal object of their hatred is ethnic Russians, Slovak East Ukrainians, and leftists in the country. And that was just fine with many of those who seized power and their foreign backers. And this includes Kolomoisky. As long as the Banderite fascist battalions he was arming and funding were fighting, ethnic Russians and East Ukrainians who weren't happy about the overthrow of the government that they had overwhelmingly democratically elected to Kiev, he was just fine with that. And then after Kolomoisky was appointed the governor of Kharkov, an eastern Ukrainian city that was had potential for a pro-Russian separatist or pro-Eastern Ukrainian surge, to set the country with the Donbass against the new regime in Kiev. He was sent there to keep it under control, and he did that. In fact, even in the pages of Foreign Policy magazine, it was crowed and boasted apart how he made deals with the city's organized crime, the mafia, to help have their thugs police and the city from protests and keep it under control. But then he had a falling out with the oligarch president Poroshenko. And one of the big sources of his wealth was Privat Bank. It was the biggest bank in Ukraine. And it was also the bank through which tens of billions of dollars of IMF money was funneled into Ukraine to prop up the new regime. And Kolomoisky, of course, took a big cut, personal share of the spoils of this for himself. There was a political battle in Ukraine. Poroshenko won. Privat Bank, the Privat Bank was nationalized by the government, and Kolomoisky went into self-exile and brooded and possibly created up Zelensky as a political candidate to come take power. So there's an open question of how much of a creature how much Kolomoisky's creature Zelensky is. We don't know. Originally in Russia, people believed, and for good reason, that Vladimir Putin was the Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky's creature. And Berezovsky, came to really regret that. And Putin drove the oligarchs out of Russian politics, and those who resisted were driven out of Russia into self-exile or sent to jail, like Khodorkovsky. So we don't know, yet. We have to see. But I'm not overly optimistic about Zelensky. What is clear is that he intends to continue the geopolitical reorientation of Ukraine towards NATO and towards eventual the ideal of ascension to the European Union, although that's never been specifically mentioned by the EU. And in fact, only 24% of this EU association agreement, about which all of this supposedly has taken place, that's why the government was supposedly overthrown, only 24% of that agreement has actually been put into effect in Ukrainian law and society. And that is the lowest hanging fruit, because the enacting that will mean privatizing off all of Ukraine's state companies and a good deal of its state natural resources, which will create literally millions of unemployed people and devastate the Ukrainian economy. At least in the short to medium term, and probably in the long term as well. That's why it hasn't been enacted. That's why the last government didn't do it. And Zelensky actually may be the one to try to push that forward, especially with his new majority, because his aides, at least, have put forward, his closest advisors, that he has a libertarian political philosophy. Now, it's really hard. That would be the first government in the world that really actually has that view. And it's really hard to see how that will match up with Ukraine's very state-heavy economics and society, where people still appreciate the benefits of a state that will do things like healthcare and education and employment and other things for them. But that's the views that he will try to push forward. He's talked about peace in East Ukraine and the Donbass, but at the same time, he's absolutely refused to meet with the leaders of the DNR and LNR, the Donetsk and Lugansk national republics, and he's absolutely refused. And that is the most basic first steps of the Minsk Accords, which, by the way, he has essentially, like the previous government, completely cast aside. He's talked to Putin on the phone now twice. He was never called and congratulated by Putin on his victory. But the conversations have been frosty, shall I say, from the readouts. And they certainly haven't made any progress. In the most recent phone call, Zelensky claims that he asked Putin to influence the self-defense militias in Donetsk and Lugansk to stop shelling his army in East Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces there, to which Putin replied, certainly, if you will stop your forces from shelling the people in cities of Donetsk and Lugansk. Because despite it being a frozen conflict, there's nightly mortar and artillery shelling and snipering back and forth, and a low body count, if you will, of that ends up around 1,000 a year, roughly on both sides. Civilians and militias and militarized, all official uniform militaries all together. So it is impossible to see how he will, have any type of political reconciliation and peace with the east of his own country if he's entirely unwilling to talk to or legitimize in any way the people that have been the authorities, the elected authorities in those regions since Ukraine split with the events of that putsch 5 years ago. Zelensky has suggested that he might have a personal meeting with Putin, but only if the presidents of the US, France, the Prime Minister of the UK, and the Chancellor of Germany were in the room to babysit him and hold his hands during the discussion.
Oh boy. Yeah.
That's why I'm both optimistic that Zelensky is not Poroshenko.
Right.
And I'm pessimistic about the chances of political reconciliation with Donbass or improved relations with Russia going forward. And Zelensky needs economic improvement in the country. The Ukrainian economy has it really went into the trough in the last 5 years, right? And most recently, the country for 2 years in a row has had the lowest level of people's confidence in their government in the entire world at 9%. And a good reason for that is the decline in their already low standard of living. So Ukraine is now the poorest country in Europe. It's poorer than Moldova, and that's saying a lot. But you can't have an improvement in Ukrainian economics, the economic activity, without an improvement in relations with Russia. Because despite all of this supposed westward turn and EU association agreement, Russia is still by far the Ukraine and the last 5 years of aggressor Ukraine and claims of invasion and so forth. Russia is still Ukraine's biggest state trading partner by far. And that's not likely to change. Ukraine simply doesn't have much that the European Union wants. They already have a pretty locked and closed agricultural system, with EU and individual state subsidies for their own agricultural sector, and they keep that a pretty tight market. So even that isn't likely. And most of Ukraine's heavy industrial activity is in East Ukraine, much of it in the Donbass. And it has, because of the legacy of the integrated Soviet economy, it's all geared towards producing chemicals and the steel and other materials for industrial uses in Russia. Again, the EU doesn't need or want it. So you can't have an improvement in Ukrainian economic sphere without improved relations with Russia. However, you can't have improved relations with Russia without the president of Ukraine sitting down and seeking political reconciliation after the events of the putsch in 2014 with the people of East Ukraine, of the Donbass. And he can't do that without inciting his own ultra-nationalists and Banderites in the country to rise up against him, where even the slightest gesture of ameliorating the excesses of the government, the regime of the last 5 years, such as loosening the language laws that restrict the use of Russian in public sphere, the language that was up until 5 years ago, the majority language of communication for the majority of the country, the majority of the people of the country. Zelensky, some of his own movies, which of course were made in the Russian language, can now not be shown in Ukraine. The president's own movies, right? And he, like I said, he is himself, of this kind of libertarian bent. He's it seems pretty sure about geopolitical orientation towards the EU and NATO, no matter what the cost. But he's not an ultra nationalist himself. Of course, neither was Poroshenko to begin with. But he would like to loosen some of these language laws because he himself is a primarily Russian-speaking Jew from East Ukraine. But any steps, even such as that, towards loosening the excesses of the last 5 years are called revanche, and it will cause a third or fourth Maidan, a uprising against him. Now, it won't succeed because it won't have the backing of the West, and Ukrainian armed forces, despite being integrated with the nationalists, should be able to separate themselves if they want to, and deal with any type of nationalist rioting, protests, etc. Primarily from West Ukraine. But it would really destabilize the country and his own rule at this point, because, like I said, all of these militias and battalions of this Banderite fascist orientation have been integrated into the police and the military structure, right. Like the National Guard, the National Druzhina, the military, for the last few years. And it's really interesting. The previous Interior Minister, Avakov, who was largely the one overseeing these battalions and who kept them protected and funded, through various, third party degrees of remove and so on. He has not been removed from office yet, and he turned against Poroshenko at the end. And it will be a big sign going forward whether Zelensky decides to keep him on or replace him. And that decision hasn't been made yet.
That suggests that maybe he doesn't really control the military, right?
Oh, he doesn't. And an incident in the last week just showed this. There was a Russian oil tanker that was seized in the Ukrainian port of Odessa. It was doing, a tanker that was dropping off, some type of whatever it was carrying. I hadn't seen the details on that. But the Ukrainian government says that it was a tanker that was involved in the incident in the Kerch Straits and the Sea of Azov, and that it was a tanker now renamed that had helped block off the Kerch Straits from these Ukrainian military boats that were, being used as a provocation by Poroshenko and not following the agreed on treaties that govern passage through these dangerous straits in order to create this incident and play up the Russian aggression and his nationalist military credentials going into the election. It didn't work. So they seized this tanker, but evidently, and this is according to Western journalists in Kiev at the pro-Western Kiev Post that have been fans of the Maidan, and you could even say kind of propaganda networkers for it. I've heard them talking on Twitter, openly, that this was done by the Ukrainian intelligence services, the SBU, without the knowledge of the president. And this may have been done as a preemptive shot to try to make sure that even if Zelensky has the inclination to, that there is no chance for him to do anything to improve relations with Russia or, East Ukraine and the Donbass. And that's really interesting. It once again says that he doesn't have complete control of the country, despite the new Rada majority. And he's got a big uphill slog if he decides to try to separate the military, the police, and the intelligence structures from these Banderite fascists and ultranationalists of West Ukraine. Now, he did order that the crew of the ship, which of course was not the same crew during that incident, to be released. And in response, Russia did nothing. They made no actions of reprisal or anything against Ukraine for the seizure of this tanker. And that tells me that Putin is giving Zelensky the benefit of the doubt and time, as it were, to get his own house into order before it decides to, resume normal tit-for-tat behavior. But of course, the servant of the people wasn't the only party to get into the Rada. Ukraine's elections are half on party list with a minimum 5% threshold and half individual mandate seats, as they call them, like how politicians are elected in the US, in individual local constituencies. Zelensky did much better among both than was expected. The second biggest party in Ukraine, though, is the pro-Russian, as it's called, opposition platform in East Ukraine, which outright won the election. It was one of only 3 regions in the country that Zelensky didn't win. They outright went to it's basically the reformed old Party of Regions.
Okay, Party of Regions.
Yeah, that's who it essentially is. They are now the second biggest party in Ukrainian politics, which tells you what the Eastern Ukrainians themselves think about this aggressor Russia and everything that has happened in Donbass for the last 5 years. They came in second at 13%. Then came the parties of Petro Poroshenko, renamed the European Solidarity Party, and the party of the other defeated oligarch, the gas princess, Yulia Tymoshenko, which is Batkivshina or Fatherland. They should both be considered nationalist parties, although antagonistic to each other. And it's the only other party to make it into is a new party as well, by a Ukrainian rock star, Vakarchuk, who has created a third, I would say, nationalist party called Voice or Golos. And they just got through the 5% threshold. And they will probably coordinate on some issues with Zelensky's servant of the people, and on others in opposition with Poroshenko's European Solidarity or Tymoshenko's Fatherland Party. So there's kind of 3 nationalist parties, if you will.
Tymoshenko really sunk in the. I thought she was doing pretty well about 6 months ago.
Yeah, he had the front runner position 6 months ago, but then someone whom people thought would be a divorce from that politics, completely changed the race, and both Tymoshenko and Poroshenko finished roughly 8% for both of them. Yeah, a big, huge drop, of course, from close to 50% to down to 8%, the third and fourth biggest parties in the country. So that was, a huge electoral defeat from them. The Vakarchuk's party won one region in West Ukraine, Lvov, which is the most West Ukrainian of West Ukrainian regions.
Yeah.
And the only area that Poroshenko won was the abroad vote.
Oh, really?
Ukrainians abroad. And that's not really the Ukrainian abroad vote, because the 3 million Ukrainians abroad who live in Russia were disenfranchised from the election. They were not allowed to vote in this supposedly free and fair election because they were regarded as politically unreliable to the new order, because they live and work in Russia, right? The supposed aggressor state. But the Ukrainians that live in the U.S. and Canada all voted for Poroshenko.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's the only, that's the only. It shows a big degree of remove from the lives of ordinary Ukrainians who wanted to throw those bums out, and the expat Ukrainians in the West, whose primary interest is seeing the country geopolitically reorientated. It's often made a big deal that the Ukrainian, the hardcore, some of the hardcore of the Ukrainian battalions and the far right Banderite fascists tried to form their own political party and get elected, and they didn't get anywhere near the 5% election threshold. But a good number of, shall we say, more mainstreamed of these extremists have already been scattered throughout the other parties, including European Solidarity and Fatherland and even Vakarchuk's new Golos party. In fact, the number 2 person on Poroshenko's European Solidarity party list, the person after him, is the ex-putsch speaker of the Rada, Andrei Parubi, the biggest neo-Nazi in the country, the guy who was the founder of the Social Nationalist Party, and who was the commandant of the fighters, of the Maidan, who overthrew the government, seized and overthrew the government in Kiev. He isn't the speaker anymore of the Rada, but he will be back in the Rada at the side of Poroshenko now. So if they try to tell you that, that all the fascists, all the ultra-nationalists, however you want to term them, are gone, that's certainly not true. Although they have certainly taken a blow and their numbers are reduced in the Rada.
Well, if they are trying to rebrand themselves, they've done that before. It wouldn't surprise me to see them trying to do that again. In fact, I just read this article in Vice. Oh, by the way, before we go on, Mark, introduce us to your pet who speaks up every now and then, because our listeners were very curious to know about him before, or he or she before.
Okay, I have 5 pets. I have 4 Shar-Pei sisters, a brown one, a white one, a black one, and a gray one. And I also have we have a disabled crow named Morgan. She's a hooded crow, a European type. It's black head and then some gray and then some black again. And we found her last year in the forest near our house. She had probably been pushed out of the nest, either from rickets or from pressure in the nest. Her legs were twisted. And the veterinarian said that, they actually tried, but there was nothing they could do about it. So she can't walk properly, which means she can't perch properly, which means she can't fly properly, and she can never be rehabilitated. So they told us to euthanize her. We said no. And we have a disabled crow in the house as a pet now. She gets around pretty well. She actually hops about on what is, kind of like between her thighs, her knees, and her ankle. She hops around on that, and you'd be surprised how well she gets around and makes short flights. We keep them wrapped up to keep them safe from, the impacts as she bounces around, hops around on them. But, she's got a big cage that's all kind of forested out with a little wooden domek and everything and plenty of toys. But she's also out of the cage for about 4 or 5 hours a day. And she is already made clear to the dogs that she's the boss of the house.
Oh, wow. I've never heard. I've heard the crows are really smart, but I've never heard of anyone with a pet. Yes.
Yeah, she's very smart. She's not a raven, so she can't actually imitate speech or anything. But yeah, she's a real troublemaker. She's got very limited strength and everything because of her balance. But what she can do with her beak, she can get into. That's for sure.
Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, I'd like to see her sometime. That's really interesting. And now everybody, audience, who is speaking up every now and then, seems like she likes to talk when you're talking sometimes.
Yeah. She's very vocal.
So, so that's all very fascinating. Especially the fact that these people who ran for the Rada, and I apologize in the beginning for saying that Zelensky was prime minister. Of course, it's president.
Yes.
It's hard for us Americans to remember who's got, whether the prime minister or the president is top dog in various countries. Sometimes we get
it confuses me. It confuses me too. So don't worry about it.
Yeah. So So now all of these grassroots, quote unquote, candidates for the Rada just showed up with Zelensky's new party and took the majority. How much money does it cost to run for office in the Ukraine? Do you have to have a lot of backing, or do they have crowdsourced funding, or where did they come from?
The rules have all changed because previously it was all based on oligarchs. All right, oligarchs controlled the candidates, they controlled the parties, they controlled the individual mandates. Each oligarch has his own television station. They control the media. Ukrainian politics has been about which oligarch you were aligned with,
right?
These clans of loyalty, if you will, and so on. But this has all changed, and Zelensky didn't really campaign so much as he went around the country doing his comedy skits. That was his idea of campaigning. It didn't tell you much about his policies other than his jokes about the previous government, but it was extremely effective. And of course, social media. And there was such a strong desire to throw the bums of the last 5 years out that it went very far. And when people went to elect the Rada members, there was no real campaigning per se. There certainly was no platform. It was vote for Zelensky's guys. The problem again is these Zelensky's guys may not necessarily be loyal to him on any particular issues because he hasn't made it particularly clear what he stands for. One thing that he does intend to do, and it seems he will get done, he wants to remove criminal immunity from the members of the Rada and judges and other offices in the country, which you can't argue is is a bad thing. It's certainly a good thing. And so he will probably do that. And he will also seek to create room in the Ukrainian constitution. And he now probably has the constitutional majority if he allies with Golos on that issue, to allow referendums in Ukrainian politics. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily
surprises me actually.
That's not necessarily a good thing going forward, but it is certainly in line with the idea that Zelensky is or at least his aides are presenting his political orientation as libertarian. And that would, I think, fit with that. And, with his desire to drive the corruption out of Ukrainian politics, whatever his foreign policy, which, of course, I'm very interested in.
Yeah, it seems like he doesn't have any control over that.
Yeah, I do wish, well, not yet anyway. I do wish him well, at least in, the fight against corruption in Ukraine. I know how bad it was in Russia in the 90s, and there are still issues of corruption in Russia, but it's certainly not as bad, anywhere near as bad as Ukraine has been. And, again, whatever the foreign policy, I do wish him well, and I think he has some good instincts on that. Although we all know that the common sentiment of the people in referendums at any given moment is not necessarily the best thing.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing either, but it all depends on the dominant political mood in the country at any given moment, and it's 50-50 whether that's going to be good or bad.
Right. Now, as I started to say before, I read this Vice article that's recent. It's within, I think, the past week. And Vice in the past has...
It was an open propaganda outlet for the Maidan.
Yeah, exactly. And, they tried to rehab, like, some of the most extreme militias, for example, like the Azov battalion. Now, this one... what they're doing is, it's very curious. I'll read you a couple paragraphs. The title is Far-Right Extremists Have Been Using Ukraine's War as a Training Ground. They're Returning Home. And they talk about, they talk to a few people. They talk to the Swedish neo-Nazi who joined the Maidan, the Azov battalion. And now he's rehabilitated. He says he's repenting. He says it was like a poison, like an addiction. And it says, researchers warn that Ukraine is radicalizing far-right foreign fighters in the same way Syria has with jihadis, albeit on a smaller scale, creating a global network of combat-tested extremists who pose a security threat that's now beginning to manifest itself. We're very concerned, said Molly Saltskog, an intelligence analyst at a strategic consultancy firm, the Sufan Group, who has tracked the mobilization of far-right foreign fighters. You have individuals who are battle-hardened, probably more radicalized than before they left. You have a global network of violent white supremacists now who can easily keep in touch on different platforms and go back home, spread that propaganda, conduct training, and move on to the next fight. And then they say, Western security services haven't taken the far-right foreign fighter threat seriously enough, says Daniel Kohler, director of the German Institute for Radicalization and De-Radicalization Studies, largely because they've overwhelmingly focused on jihadist foreign fighters returning from Syria and Iraq in recent years. And then in the end, they cite Bellingcat. And they say, in the interview uncovered by the investigative website Bellingcat, Furham said their efforts would also help white nationalist forces in one country where he believed they had the best shot of coming to power. It's like a petri dish for fascism, and they do have serious intentions of helping the rest of Europe in retaking our rightful lands, he said. And then one more thing, he says, I can't even read this name, Kaper Rekovic, head of defense and security programs at Slovakia's Globsec think tank, said some recruits had seemed indifferent about which side they actually fought on. Meanwhile, far-right foreign fighters who joined pro-Russian separatists saw the battle as defending the separatists' right to self-determination against Western imperialism. Many were also drawn by a sense of allegiance to Vladimir Putin, lionized by many on the far right as one of the last defenders of white traditionalist Christian Europe. So I was trying to think, all right, what are they doing here? It almost seems like they're trying to equate.
Yeah. That's, of course, entirely false characterization. They're trying to play up the far left people that joined the fight in the DNR and LNR against the fascists. They're trying to portray them as far right in this and trying to draw some type of equation between them. And there was a big scandal in the Italian and
they mentioned
British media. There was a missile that some far right figures that had been linked one degree of remove with some people who had fought in Ukraine for the regime, right? Far right forces there had fought in some of these battalions. They actually had their arms on a missile, I believe, of Qatari ownership. And this was discovered in a police raid, and the current one of the current ministers of the far right, far left Italian coalition Eurosceptic government was associated with this. He said some far right figures had made threats against his life, and this was part of the investigation against them. And the BBC actually completely it's quite obviously purposefully mistranslated the police statements, saying that these people had fought for the government in Ukraine and said that they fought for the quote separatists of East Ukraine. And it was a kind of a big, not actually a big scandal, except for those who are paying attention. But the BBC was forced to redact their statements and simply remove any mention of who they actually fought for. And then the Italian police were pressured from above to do so as well. So that just goes unattributed. It's not clear now which side they fought for. This is the all too predictable blowback. It's the same thing. Whether the U.S. is funding, proxies to overthrow governments, jihadis in the Middle East, or ultranationalists and far right, Banderite fascists in Ukraine, it always blows back on them. And these Azov, the right sector, they quite explicitly from the beginning had a fascist revolutionary ideological message. They weren't shy about it, that they wanted to seize Ukraine and then spread that to the rest of Europe. What did they call it? The reconquest or the reconquista? They were quite open about that. And I wrote about that online at the time. This is all too predictable. The U.S. government, of course, is not too particularly worried about this sort of thing because it is small scale. And, the occasional losses in a terrorist or mass shooting or whatever incident just increase the funding for and calls for a national security state, helps them militarize. So, it's no big, cost to them if a few people die or are killed in extremist imitation incidents. But these people, Azov has programs where American white supremacists, European ultranationalists go get training, get combat experience on the front lines in the Donbass and go back home and organize back there as they can. And like I said, Bellingcat exposed as well. They must have actually started paying attention to something that Russian media and much of the alternative media in the West has been saying about what is actually happening in Ukraine and what the end implications and results of that would be for the last 5 years.
Yeah, it's always been very curious how unconcerned governments and media were about what we could see happening, me from afar, and relying on people like you and other people who were English speaking in the region. These, really scary characters who were clearly on the front lines. And in fact, Kolomoisky was funding some of those people. I remember the white vans, the Privat Bank white vans with the militias in them, acting almost like shock troops in eastern Ukraine at the time. And it was really horrible.
To show you that things have not changed in Ukraine yet, all these battalions, they still exist. They're still integrated. That hasn't changed. A Ukrainian media outlet, Hromadske, wrote in an article that one of the most indisputable of these groups, C14, which stands for the 14 words of white nationalism. We must secure a future for the Aryan white children of our race, or whatever, racist nonsense that is. That's the name of the group. It's openly acknowledged that they've been involved in pogroms of Roma in Kiev, right, of gypsies, right?
Yeah.
They are still supported and funded through the Interior Ministry by the Ukrainian government. That hasn't changed yet, if it ever will. Well, Hromadske called them neo-Nazis. Well, C14 took them to court and claimed that Hromadske was ruining their reputation. They said, we aren't neo-Nazis. We just happen to have the 14 words of white nationalism as our title and so on. We killed a few gypsies, but we're not neo-Nazis. And they won. The Ukrainian judge decided for them. And Hromadske was fined $136 for calling neo-Nazis neo-Nazis. And the ironic thing about this is Hromadske was the principal propaganda outlet of the Maidan, which many of the activists and rioters who were involved in it say it never would have succeeded without it. That was openly started up and funded by the U.S. and Dutch embassies. They're quite proud about that. They don't try to hide it. It's on their news releases and so on. And now 5 years later, the Banderites, the ultranationalists that fought them into power, these useful idiots. They've served their purpose. Now they're an inconvenience and an embarrassment. And if now you acknowledge that they're neo-Nazis and they've are embedded so far in Ukrainian society now even an American and Dutch funded propaganda outlet gets fined for acknowledging that neo-Nazis are in fact neo-Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? It's just
no, you can't. That's why I usually sign off on such things with just another day in Banderistan, hashtag Banderistan, formerly known as Ukraine.
Well, it seems like from Vice's perspective and whoever's backing them, they actually are going to find them to be useful. They talk about training for a race war. They talk about they do talk about the incident with Italy, but they also try to attach them to France, to the Yellow Vest. So it almost seems like they're going to try to tie, and maybe there are ties, I don't know, the populist movements in Europe. They're going to try to say that these people are connected with that or driving it.
Any threat to the centrist hegemonic, whether it comes from the right or left, they will attempt to try to equate it as one big assault on their hegemonic technocratic center in Europe. And it has to be said that article, which of course is a complete 180 from what Vice did just 5 years ago, reporting on Ukraine. The author, the person, the video journalist Simon Ostrovsky, who did that original piece for Vice, complained about this new one online, particularly about the references in the article to a civil war and a civil conflict in East Ukraine. And Vice went and edited that new article to remove those references and instead refer to the Russian invasion.
I was wondering what happened to him and why he wasn't the one who
was the author. He made a big stink about it online on Twitter, and I assume in private in emails to Vice. He doesn't work for them anymore. He's moved on to bigger and better propaganda things. But Vice did go back and re-edit that article and remove all references to a civil war and a civil conflict, an actual accurate characteristic of what's going on in Ukraine, or at least in East Ukraine, and replace it with the quote Russian invasion.
Well, it's getting late where you are, so I really need to let you go, but I feel like I still just scratched the surface. I've got like 6 other topics here I wanted to talk to you about. The Minsk talks, we already kind of talked about that. I'm curious about the military operations and the Navy, the things I've been hearing. The protests in Moscow, which I assume are being exaggerated here. I don't know. But also
3,000 to 5,000 people protesting in a city of 14 million, but Moscow is about to fall. A revolution is at hand,
And then I haven't listened to it yet, but there's an interview with Putin with the Financial Times that seems interesting. And I
that was a big one, yes.
And I think that Chris Wallace was just there, and I don't think it's been published yet, but I think he did a Putin interview too. So anyway, and I'm also curious, about Khodorkovsky and about, Victoria Nuland and her extreme influence in Ukraine and sort of what happened. What did that, did someone else inherit that? And so maybe next time we talk, we could touch on some of these things, or there are probably other things that that I'm not even aware of that we should talk about too. But for now, I really should let you go. And anything else that you want to wrap up with before we close?
Nope, I think that does it for now. But there is an inexhaustible supply of things, Russia, Ukraine, and former Soviet Union related events to talk about. So I'll be glad to do it regularly with you.
Yeah. I mean, because we didn't even touch Syria and Venezuela and stuff. I mean, it's crazy. And the trade wars, and my gosh, you're right. There's an
INF, the New START treaties.
Oh my, yeah. How could I forget that? All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Please tell people where they can find your work and how they can support you.
Yeah, you can find me right on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. And I also, of course, do media commentary for Sputnik, for RT, for Russian media, for Chinese media, for Iranian media, the Turks, the Iranians, the Pakistani, the Indians. I'm kind of all over.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It was great to talk with you.
Thanks for having me, Joanne.
Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Mark Sleboda. Follow Mark on Twitter at MarkSleboda1 and on Facebook, and look for his appearances on RT and other international channels. Around the Empire podcast, listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build out the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free. youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire, and follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. The audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire. It's where we have the most traffic, and there are many ways to listen to it. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, or listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/c/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm working on a new look and new kinds of content, including video live streams, mini docs, and the like, and I really need your help to build up that YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.